Okay, this is Jerry Logan talking about today the review for the first exam of Intro to Sociology. So let me get started with the review of Exam 1. So I'm going to start out with the most current slide, Chapter 1. So the exam is going to be covering Chapter 1, the sociological imagination, Chapter 3, culture and media, and Chapter 4 on socialization. So this exam consisted of 50 questions, multiple choice, true, false, and some form of fill in the blank. Each question is worth 2 points. So remember that because it's in this particular time, it's an online exam. So make sure you have all your PowerPoint presentations open and making sure you have access to them as you review the exam. Take the exam. So as you're taking the exam, keep in mind the time management, being familiar with where everything is. This is the intro part, sociological imagination, culture, and media and socialization. So just make sure you're able to have each of those PowerPoint slides open as I'm about to do now. So one of the things is I go through giving an exam, and when I was a student taking an exam, I would say, okay, well, it's 50 questions, so what are the most 50 important things of these particular 3 chapters I know which would be on the exam. And I think when you have that approach, you're thinking to yourself like, okay, cool, I can figure out like maybe narrow down to 30 or 40 questions which I know for sure. Definitely, as you know, being this is an intro to sociology class, one of the first questions you know for sure would be the definition of sociology. So I'm not going to go out and read all over this stuff again, but make sure you're familiar with the definition of sociology because it is an exam question. So, of course, culture is an exam question, definition of culture, definition of socialization. So you already knocked out 3 questions out of 50, so now you have to figure out the remaining 47. So as we go through this, keep in mind the definitions, the early sociologists, the theories, of course, is going to be on the exam. So different terminologies, but make sure you're familiar with the whole concept of each particular chapter. So you got to know the definition of sociology, so you definitely need to know this slide. Now, this particular slide, as I go through, I'm just kind of mentioning, you got to know this, not this, for the exam to try to help students out, to narrow it down. It is easier to try to narrow it down a little bit, so I'm just going to give you some heads on what some stuff to look for, definitely for the exam. So I don't think this is on the exam, Origins of Sociology. But you do have to know sociological imagination and social institution. Now remember, when you're giving the definition for the exam, I'm going to have, for instance, for example, question 3 might say the ability to connect to the most basic, intimate aspect of an individual's life to seemingly impersonal and remote historical forces. So it may not be word for word, but just say A might be social institution, B, sociological imagination, C might be this, or D. So make sure you're familiar, like, okay, this is a sociological imagination. So it may not just be word for word, but make sure you understand it. And that way, when you answer the question, you know exactly where you're going. So the social institutions, I'm not asking about that on the exam, not about this slide either, about the Industrial Revolution. This is part of the conversation, not asking you about the French Revolution, but you do have to know Comte. So the next few sociologists that I'm about to describe and talk about in Chapter 1, as we went over in Chapter 1, it's in my video as well if you need more concrete information about each sociologist. So remember that as I ask a question about who did this, I'm going to say, who did this right here? Like, who is the founder of sociology? A, is it Comte? B, is it Herbert Spencer? C, is it Karl Marx? D, is it Durkheim? You know, so you say, well, it's Comte because he is the founder of sociology. So, of course, for an exam, if it were me, I'd be saying, okay, for sure, we definitely know that Comte is the founder of sociology and not the other persons. So you need to become familiar with each of the sociologists to make sure that you're able to narrow it down to which sociologist is who. Also for the exam, I do not do dates. So I'm not going to ask you back in 1853 back in 1947, back in 2002. I'm not really asking for dates for you to answer the dates. So that's kind of like high school stuff in elementary school to me when you're asking, in my opinion, what year did this occur? I don't do that. I just need you to understand each of the sociologists. I need you to understand in chapter one the sociological theories and what did each sociologist do. So that's pretty much the focus of this first chapter. So I need you to know about Comte. So don't try to study word for word. Just be familiar with Comte. So now I'm going to ask you which sociologist was an early engineer. No, I'm not doing that. That's kind of petty. So I'm just asking specific questions about the individual and what is their claim to fame, as they say. What is one of the most important things about this sociologist? So really not so much on this slide in particular, but just understanding who he is as well. Positivism is the scientific study of social patterns. Not for sure, I can't remember 100% if it's on the exam, but you should be familiar with positivism. Not going to ask you which author wrote this book or what was the name of Comte's book. No, I'm not going to try to pair up and do stuff like that, no. So in this particular slide, no, you don't have to remember the names and dates of the book. One of the key things about Comte you should know, he believed that using scientific methods to reveal the laws by which societies and individuals interact will usher in a new positive age of history, even though he didn't do the actual research itself. So I need you to be familiar with this slide when Comte talked about what holds a society together, what creates a social order, this new science, which he started with sociology. He himself believed that a sociologist would reform the entire society, making it a better place to live. So definitely you got to know Comte. Herbert Spencer, the second founder of sociologists. Remember, I talked about him in the video. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. So make sure you're familiar with social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Remember, he said helping the poor was merely wrong and helping the less fit survive. So he was against that. He's also the social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. He disagreed with Comte's that sociologists should guide social reform. So be familiar with Herbert Spencer as well. Next person, y'all know Karl Marx. Karl Marx, he talked about human misery lays in class conflict. One of the founders of the conflict theory was inspired by Karl Marx, the conflict theory. So if you really kind of understand the conflict theory, kind of when I think about conflict theory, I think about Karl Marx. And remember, Marx is the one who talks about the capitalists and the bourgeoisies, and that they were natural enemies, and that in order for the capitalists, the proletariats and the bourgeoisie, in order for the proletariats to gain power, they would have to do it by some form of a revolution. So make sure you're familiar with Karl Marx. This is more information about Karl Marx. So I'm not going to ask you what's the definition of capitalism and stuff like that, but I just need you to understand his whole importance, how he talks about the disparities in wealth between the owners of the factories and the workers. And the struggles between the different social classes. So once you get that understanding of Karl Marx, when you see something regarding the question, you can say, "Oh, that's Marx. That's not Comte. That's not Herbert Spencer. That's Karl Marx." This particular slide, also be aware of. Remember, there's the two classes: the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and those who own the means of production, and the proletariat, which are the exploited workers. He helped introduce the conflict theory. Make sure you're familiar with Karl Marx. George Simmel was not going to be on the exam this time. So kind of this is actually a review for the exam, so I'm not going to waste your time, but you understand that George Simmel, but he won't be on the exam. Durkheim is social integration. Remember, he studied suicide. Durkheim's identification of the key role of social integration. People are more likely to commit suicide if their ties to others in the communities are weak. So he also, through his study, he said that men would more likely commit suicide than women. However, like before, a married woman with kids, ties to the community, ties to the church, ties to a family are less likely to commit suicide. So remember, Durkheim was actually the first one to do research, and he also helped made society as a separate discipline. So we think about Durkheim, remember social integration, and people are tied to their social groups as a key factor in suicide, in studying suicide. Make sure you know Durkheim for the exam. Don't have to know this chart. Max Weber, of course, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So we talked about him before. Has he? I'm not going to ask you about the book, but remember Max Weber is prominent for the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, and he talked about the Calvinists, which leads to the creation of capitalism based upon religion. So make sure you're familiar with Max Weber. Read over this a little bit more. Not going to ask you about the book, what year, stuff like that, but just be familiar with Max Weber, excuse me. Not going to really question you about this slide about anti-positivism and stuff like that. But remember, the Protestant ethic, invest capital in order to make more money, the spirit of capitalism. He disagreed with Marx's claim that economic is the central force in social change, and he said that role belongs to religion. So we get into social stratification. We hear more about the differences between Max Weber and Karl Marx. So, as we get into the American sociologists, we get into the ladies, we're going to get into Harriet Martinet. Make sure you're familiar with her. Remember, her work was ignored, and she had published Society in America before Durkheim and Max Weber were even born. So just be a little bit more familiar with Martinet. Again, not asking about the books and year. Just remember the role of Martinet. More information on Martinet, just continue to read that. And then Jane Addams, of course, she will be on the exam. So just because, for instance, if I have a sociologist's name, so George Simmel is not going to be on the exam, but he could be an option for A, B, C, and D, or E as a choice. So, of course, one is the wrong answer, but I might put down George Simmel, I might put down someone else, and for you to understand, okay, that person is not the ones who did this. This person is not who we spoke about as far as for the exam, but other names might show up as a way to throw you off. I still have to quiz and test you as well. So when we look at Jane Addams, you have to know Jane Addams. Remember, she co-founded Hull House, Center for Help Immigrants in Chicago, a leader in women's suffrage. She also won the recipient of the Nobel Prize for Peace. She co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union and co-founded NAACP. So make sure you're familiar with Jane Addams. Then, of course, is W.E.B. Du Bois. Published a book each year from 1896 to 1914. First African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. W.E.B. Du Bois, remember, he spent his lifetime studying relations between African-Americans and whites. He was more of a social reformer, so make sure that you're familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois for the exam. So when we get into Karl Parsons, just remember, if it's not so much his name being as an exam question answer, but just maybe an answer on the question in the multiple choice part where he's not. So I might say something about C. Wright Mills and say, is it Mills or is it Parsons? And make sure you're familiar with Parsons so you can immediately say, oh, that wasn't Parsons. His emphasis, remember, shifted to social theory. He developed abstract models of society that influenced a generation of sociologists. Parsons' social action theory was the first systematic and generalizable theory of social systems developed in the U.S. and Europe. So just kind of read over a little bit more about Karl Parsons and know his separation from C. Wright Mills. Mills, remember, he talked about the role of the power elite in U.S. society. So make sure you're familiar with C. Wright Mills, a little bit more about it. Mills, he urged sociologists to go back to social reform. Our freedom was threatened by the interests of a group called the power elite, which he referred to as the top leaders of business, politics, and the military. So make sure you're familiar with this slide, the power elite, C. Wright Mills' points of view of social reform. So the examiner's not going to ask you about basic. I don't think it's not gonna ask you about that. Basic applied in public sociology. Don't remember putting it on there. It's good information to know. However, we're gonna go into part two, which is talks about theory. So this is the second part of my other video, which talks about chapter one, part two of chapter one, which talks about a theory. Definition of a theory, you must know that. And remember, you also must know the three major theories: symbolic interactionism, function analysis, and conflict theory. Now, I did a part two, chapter one video, which further goes in details and examples. I think it was like 35 minutes talking about this part. Watch the video again. Also keep the PowerPoint available. But we want to talk about the three major sociological theories and being able to know the difference. Because all three theories will be on all three exams. And as that happened every year for I don't know how much, last 9 or 10 years, that someone has used one of these three major theories in their written assignment. So you're going to find yourself in a written assignment according to the functionalist analysis, functionalist perspective. The conflict theory states. It's been consistently for the last 9 or 10 years for somebody at least used them. So the next couple of slides talks about that. So even though I'm just going to ask you general questions about the theory, make sure you're very familiar with the differences in the theory. Remember that George Herbert Mead, I'm not going to ask you about him being one of the founders of the symbolic interactionists, him and Charles Cooley. That's later for the socialization chapter. Remember symbolic interactionists, make sure you know the difference. The steady face interaction. They use the use of symbols is the key to understanding how we view the world, how we communicate with one another. Remember, I probably talked about this a lot in the video, symbolic interactionists. So make sure you look at the video as well and just kind of pay attention. What are the biggest things of the symbolic interaction? They studied on a micro level, face-to-face interaction, also through the use of symbols. Don't have to know this slide, not this one. Of course, Robert Merton, we'll talk about him a little bit later in deviance on strain theory. Function analysis, we're going to talk about that. Remember, society is a unit, a whole unit made up of interrelated parts that work together. Each part with a function, when fulfilled, contributes to society's equilibrium. So make sure you're familiar, manifest or latent functions, which is also theirs, functions and dysfunctions. So make sure you study this particular slide with the definition of the functionist perspective. You don't have to worry about this slide right here. As we go over to the conflict theory, make sure you know what's going on with the conflict theory. Remember, the conflict theory talks about society in a state of perpetual conflict due to competition for limited resources. He also talks about how status and power and conflicts arise when the power is unevenly distributed between groups and societies. So if you go back to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, how it's unequally distributed between those groups, which does create conflict. So make sure you review this a little bit more, these slides on the conflict theory, making sure you have a better perspective. I'm not going to ask you about none of the theories in marriage and the divorce rate, so just pretty much, that's for later on for the other exams, but right now just being familiar with the basic part of the conflict theory. Also remember for the exam, the functions in the conflict theory is on the micro level, the larger scale, and they study symbolic interactionists on the smaller scale, which is the micro level. So make sure you're definitely familiar with that as well. So pretty much also look at this table. This table is good and handy to have because it also teaches more information about the three theoretical perspectives in sociology. So take some time to review this because this is a way that you can review this and see more information about the macro and micro level. So pretty much that's all I have for the chapter one. For the exam, I'm going to switch on over because the other part is on research, and the chapter on research will not be on the exam. So no part of chapter 2 for research will be on the exam. So we're going to continue on to chapter 3, culture and media. Of course, the definition of culture will be on the exam. Got to know the definition of culture. So make sure you're familiar with this, the definition, which will be on the exam. Study this slide right here on this PowerPoint and make sure you can answer the definition of culture. Also, there's two types of culture: material culture and non-material culture. Remember, material culture is the groups, the objects, distinguish a group, materialistic things, buildings, weapons, utensils, machines, hairstyles, clothing, and jewelry. Make sure you're familiar with the material culture. And then there's the non-material culture, a group way of thinking, including its values and beliefs and social norms and other assumptions about the world as well. So this is part of the discussion question. So think back to some of the discussion questions that we all had regarding why we went over this information, and it is a tool also to help you for the exam, but also help you navigate through the exam as you answer these questions. Culture universals, I don't believe that's on the exam. Culture shock and ethnocentrism is on the exam. Make sure you know culture shock and ethnocentrism, disorientation that people experience when they come in contact with a fundamentally different culture. And ethnocentrism, the judging of one's own culture as a yardstick in judging individuals and societies. Make sure you know culture shock and ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism will be on the exam. You also basically, when you're trying to relate to the culture, not judge it, but understand the culture based on your own standards. Make sure you're familiar with cultural relativism. Symbolic culture is another term they say for non-material. You got to know the definition of symbol, something in which we attach meaning and we communicate with one another. And also learning about gestures. Of course, we use gestures to communicate with our bodies and we communicate with each other. But keep in mind, you need to know these three things for the exam. Conveying messages without words. Gesture means different things among cultures. But gestures also can lead to misunderstanding. Also know the definition of language. Symbols that can combine in an infinite number of ways and can represent not only objects, but also abstract thought. So make sure you're familiar with this slide on language. This Worth's hypothesis, I doubt. I don't think this is on here. And logistic irrelativity, I don't think this is on the exam right here as well. But you definitely have to know values, norms, and sanctions. Make sure you study that. The values, norms, expectation of right behavior. How values tell us how to behave. It's not so much a law, it's a norm, expectations of right behavior. And make sure you're familiar with sanctions, positive and negative sanctions. Folkways and moreways will be on the exam. Remember, norms that are not strictly enforced. So folkways, I use the example, if you go to a baseball game and the guys take off their shirt, they're not going to get kicked out. You know, okay, cool, you came in with a shirt. The guys sit around shirtless, walk around shirtless. That is a norm, expectation of right behavior, but since it's a folkway, they're not going to really strictly enforce it. Mores, norms that are strictly enforced. If you try to go into a black tie affair party with no shirt on, they go like, nah, you can't come in, you need a shirt. So that's more of a more, where it's strictly enforced. Any questions? Also, moral holidays, a holiday from everyday conventions and morals, an occasional ritual time of year. We talked about that, stuff like Mardi Gras. We also talked about when in sports championships where it's kind of the laws are relaxed a little bit, where you ordinarily get arrested, but sometimes because it's a moral holiday, that just seemingly just the police is kind of lax a little bit. Make sure you're familiar with moral holiday. More information on moral holiday. High culture and popular culture, I don't believe won't be on the exam. Subculture and counterculture is definitely on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with that. That's the culture within the culture of a larger culture, especially when they have their own norms, values, beliefs, even the ways of communication. So you think about people who are gamers, that is a subculture. They go to the event every year. I forgot the name, forgive me, persons, who go to different events based upon superhero costumes or stuff like that. It's a culture within, someone who's gothic is another form of a subculture. Counterculture, a group whose behaviors, values, norms, and related behaviors place them in opposition to the broader culture. So make sure you know subculture as well as counterculture. So I don't think these are on the exam. Pluralistic society, core values and value tradition. No, this won't be on the exam. No, this won't be on the exam. Value cluster, no. Nope. Idea and real culture, I'm not sure exactly if it's on the exam, but make sure you study that as well. That's pretty much simple. Ideas culture is basically the idea of life. So the goal is held out for them. So peace boost, idea, value, and norms. But real culture is basically what you're really doing. So remember, idea what a group considers worth aiming for, and real culture is basically what people really actually do. I think cultural diffusion would be on. Make sure you know cultural diffusion, the spread of cultural traits from one group to another. Don't worry about cultural lag, new technology for the exam. Cultural leveling, nah, it's not for the exam. So the theories of functionist and conflict theory, I do not believe those are on the exam. But it's always good to be familiar with the functionist perspective on culture. Also, the conflict theory. Read over this stuff. Make sure you be familiar with this stuff. Not so much just for the exam purpose, but make sure you're familiar with the whole symbolic interactionist again regarding culture and media. Reflection theory would definitely be on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with reflection theory. Media, how the media is used. Of course, it's a platform or vehicle that present or communicate information. Make sure you understand this particular slide, how the mass media is being used. Hegemony, of course, definitely would be on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with hegemony, a condition by which a dominant group uses its power to elicit the voluntary consent of the popular masses. So be familiar with hegemony. Well, that's all I have for that particular slide. So now we go over to the last slide in socialization. So, of course, you already know socialization will be on the exam. So make sure you're familiar with the definition of socialization because it is an exam question. Personality, no, that's not really on the exam. Nah, behaviorism, biological sciences versus social sciences, not for the exam, not about the babies. Definitely got to know Charles Cooley and the looking glass self. Definitely will be on the exam as we talk about socialization to the self and the mind. The looking glass self, make sure you're familiar with this. And there are three elements of the looking glass self. The definition of the three elements. Number one, imagine how we appear to those around us. Number two, interpret others' reactions. And number three, we develop a self-concept. So make sure you're familiar with this particular slide, which will be on the exam. George Herbert Mead, of course, he talks about how important the play is in developing the self. As we play with others, we learn to take the role of the other. George Herbert Mead and role taking would be on the exam. Know the definition of self and know the definition of taking the role of the other person. We talked about this in my video regarding socialization. Make sure you're familiar with this for the exam. The I and the me, make sure you're familiar with I and me from George Herbert Mead for the exam as well. Significant other and generalized other, of course, that would be for the exam. Individual, someone you significantly influence or someone else, someone basically who you know, significant other. Generalized others, whether or not you met this person or not, but they had an influence on your life. That's the generalized other. So make sure you know the difference between the significant other and the generalized other for the exam. The 5 stages, be familiar with the 5 stages of how we take the role of the other person. Number 1, remember the self is not there at birth. Infants only know the I part. The self, you're not born with a self according to George Herbert Mead. So as you remember and read over the rest of this stuff, 2, 3, 4, and 5, be familiar for the exam. Anticipatory socialization, learning to play a key role in entering into the process of learning in advance and anticipated future role or status. Make sure you're familiar with this one. The life course is really not on the exam. Didn't get into the life course. It's good to know. Of course, we talked about gender socialization, and gender roles. All 3 of those will be on the exam. Make sure you're familiar with gender socialization, and gender roles. So I may ask a question for one of them, but make sure you're familiar with them as well. Mass media, how the mass media shapes the culture of the people, as we talked about in culture, but they use it in the socialization part through advertisement. We talked about the ads that you watch on TV, the different movies that we watch that leads us lessons in gender, how video games and television is as well. Make sure you're familiar with that. Agents of socialization: family, school, peers, the workplace, religion, government, mass media. Definitely know the definition for agents of socialization and be familiar with each of the agents of socialization. So the next slide talks a little bit more about these, so make sure you're familiar. You know, it's kind of stuff which you know already. You think about it. Who helps socialize you? You learn from your peers. You learn from your parents. You learn from, even at the workplace, your religion does it. The media helps shapes it as well. So, also as we wind down for the review, re-socialization. The key word is re-socialization, meaning you have to be re-socialized. The process of learning new norms, values, attitudes, and behaviors. And remember, it takes place at a total institution. So definitely know re-socialization. And remember the total institutions and the degradation ceremony. So remember, when you enter the total institution, like prison, jail, or the military, you're greeted by degradation, which is a form of a degrading ceremony. You get stripped down, have to put down a uniform in prison based upon the crime that you commit. You're known by your inmate number, so then you be considered a state property. So there's a process you learn. Okay, now you got to be re-socialized into the norms, values, and cultures in prison as you're greeted with this degradation ceremony in this total institution. So make sure you're familiar with those as well. Dramaturgical theory. Remember, that's Irving Goffman. Talks about the front and the backstage. So definitely need to know the definition of dramaturgical theory, but also need you to know the definition for the front stage as well as the backstage. Here's the definition of front stage. Make sure you're familiar. Just kind of read over all this stuff. When you watch a play and someone comes out and performs, they're on the front stage, a script, costume, setting, lines that you use, but Goffman applies that to social life. Look at the front stage and then also be familiar with the backstage, as where the performer can relax, so he or she can drop their front, forego speaking to their lines, and step out of character. So make sure you're familiar with the front and backstage and dramaturgical theory for the first exam. Social interaction. You got to know all these right here. Remember, status is a recognized position that you occupy. You occupy a status, but you play a role. To do this in behavior is expected of someone who holds a particular status. Remember, you occupy, I'm going to throw your hand, true or false. You occupy a status and you play a role, which is true. So there are true or false questions on there, so make sure you don't get caught up. Role strain and role conflict. Some of my students struggled with that before, knowing the difference. Please know the difference between a role strain, as you see the definition, and a role conflict. A single status, conflict, two or more roles pertaining to the different statuses. I underline it for a reason. Make sure you're familiar with that. In status set, all the statuses one holds simultaneously. Ascribed status, the status which you are born. Achieved status, the status which one enters, voluntary. And in your master status, one status that stands out or overrides all others. Be familiar with all four of those as well for the exam. Ethnomethodology. You got to know ethnomethodology for the exam. Know the definition. Pretty much the first paragraph kind of just study ethnomethodology, which will be on the exam. So one of the things about the exam I caution students is do not jump the gun. Read each question carefully. Read each word in the question carefully. I might pose a question. This person was the founder of sociology. A, Herbert Spencer. B, Comte. C, Max Weber. D, Durkheim. Of course, you know it's Compton. Or I might do a true and false. It's true that Herbert Spencer was the founder of sociology. True or false? False. I'm going to ask a question. Comte believed that there are two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, who are natural enemies. False. So make sure you don't just see the line as, okay, that's who it is. Make sure you read each word carefully, and then you know exactly which one. And that way you can make sure you know the correct answer. So some people jump the gun and say, oh, I just saw this and I clicked. No, you just saw that true and false. Some of those are true and some of those are false. Yes, as one of my students called it, there are some petty questions. However, it's not a lot of them, but make sure you read each and every question. So, pretty much for the exam, make sure you stay within the time frame. Make sure also that you have a nice little space, location where it's comfortable, not loud. You have some time to complete the exam. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, don't do it during the exam, but after the exam or before the exam. So take your time. It's available for the week. Do not wait till the last minute and say, oh, I forgot it was this week. No, pay attention to the content on the for the class which is being posted. So be familiar, like, okay, this is the start date for the exam, this is the end date. I don't want to wait till that Sunday at 7 o'clock and say, okay, I'm going to knock the exam out. Do not procrastinate it. Make sure you're familiar with the material. This is open notes class, so this is no reason for us to get stressful. Just try to relax and take your time for the exam. So I know you all going to do well in the exam. Looking forward to seeing those good grades that you all have. Any questions again, send me an email, let me know.